I am Margaret Chen, 59 years old, a retired investment banker who spent 3 decades building wealth for clients while watching my own family crumble from the inside. For my entire marriage, my late husband Richard told me that motherhood was no place for someone like me, especially a woman who cared more about spreadsheets than soccer games, or so he said. But the worst humiliation did not come from him. It came from my son Derek, the golden child, the favored one, the heir apparent to a fortune he did nothing to earn. Right in the middle of my husband's funeral reception, with 200 guests watching, Derek stood at the microphone during the eulogy portion and said, "My father built everything we have. My mother just showed up to collect the checks." Everyone shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some nodded. A few of Richard's business partners actually smiled. Derek looked at me like I was the help, like I was some gold digger who married up and contributed nothing. They had no idea that the grieving widow they just humiliated was the sole trustee of a $47 million estate, the architect of every investment strategy that built the Chen family fortune, and the only person who could authorize a single dollar to leave the family trust. I was the only person who could decide whether Derek would inherit anything at all. The funeral home smelled like lilies and expensive cologne, that particular combination of floral arrangement and old money that permeates every high society gathering in Greenwich, Connecticut. I stood near the back of the room, away from the main crowd, watching my son Derek work the room like he owned it, which in his mind, he probably did. He wore Richard's Patek Philippe watch, the one my husband had promised him since Derek was 16, the one that cost more than most people's cars. Derek's wife, Amanda, stood beside him in a black Chanel dress that I knew cost at least $8,000 because I had bought her an identical one 2 Christmases ago, which she never wore, saying it was not her style. Apparently, it was her style now that Richard was dead, and she needed to look the part of the grieving daughter-in-law. My daughter Nina sat in the corner with her husband James and their 2 kids, barely acknowledged by anyone, wearing a simple black dress from Nordstrom that she probably agonized over buying because Nina always worried about money, always counted pennies, always made sure she was not a burden. That was the difference between my children. Derek took, Nina gave, and Richard had made sure everyone knew which one he valued more. The reception was winding down when Derek approached me, Amanda trailing behind him like a shadow, her hand resting on his arm in that possessive way she had, as if she needed to remind everyone that she had captured the prize, the golden son, the chosen heir. Derek's smile was wide, but his eyes were cold, that particular combination of charm and calculation that he had learned from watching his father manipulate business deals for decades. He leaned in close, his breath smelling like the Macallan 25 that Richard's colleagues had been pouring freely all afternoon, and he said in a voice just loud enough for Amanda to hear, but quiet enough that nearby guests would not catch the words, "We need to talk about the estate, Mom. Amanda and I have plans, and we need to know what Dad left us so we can move forward." I felt my jaw tighten, felt the familiar burn of being treated like an obstacle instead of a person, like a gatekeeper instead of a grieving widow, like someone whose only purpose was to facilitate Derek's ambitions. I looked past him to where Nina was helping her daughter Emma into her coat, patient and gentle, completely unaware that her brother was already calculating how to divide an inheritance that had not even been read yet. I turned back to Derek and said in a voice that was calm and measured and gave away nothing, "The estate reading is next week. We will discuss everything then." Derek's smile faltered for just a moment, just long enough for me to see the flash of irritation cross his face, the entitled frustration of someone who was used to getting immediate answers, immediate gratification, immediate access to whatever he wanted. Amanda squeezed his arm and said in that syrupy voice she used when she wanted something, "We just want to plan appropriately, Margaret. Derek has some investment opportunities that are time-sensitive." Investment opportunities. I almost laughed. Derek had never successfully invested a dollar in his life without Richard bailing him out when things went south, which they always did. The guests filtered out slowly, offering condolences that felt rehearsed and hollow, telling me how sorry they were for my loss, how Richard was a great man, how lucky I was to have had him. Lucky. That word kept appearing, as if being married to a man who publicly dismissed my contributions and privately controlled every aspect of my life was some kind of blessing. I smiled and nodded, and thanked them for coming, playing the role of the gracious widow, the supportive wife, the woman who stood behind the great man. It was a role I had perfected over 33 years of marriage, a performance so practiced that I barely felt like myself anymore. Nina approached as the last guests left, her 7-year-old daughter Emma holding her hand, and she said quietly, "Are you going to be okay, Mom? Do you want me to stay?" I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw the worry in her eyes, the genuine concern, the love that expected nothing in return. This was the child Richard had barely noticed, the daughter he introduced at parties as our other child, when he bothered to introduce her at all. This was the child who called me every week, who remembered my birthday, who asked how I was doing and actually waited for the answer. I squeezed her hand and said, "I will be fine, sweetheart. Take your family home. We will talk soon." Nina hugged me, a real hug, not the performative air kiss embrace that Amanda had given me earlier, and then she gathered her family and left. Derek and Amanda had already gone, disappearing the moment the important guests departed, off to whatever plans they had that were more pressing than staying with a grieving widow. I stood alone in the funeral home lobby, surrounded by flower arrangements that would die in a few days, holding a memorial card with Richard's photo on it, the official portrait from his company website, where he looked distinguished and powerful and completely in control. That was how everyone would remember him. That was the legacy he built. But I remembered other things. I remembered the night 27 years ago when I told him I was pregnant with Nina, and he sighed heavily and said, "I suppose we can handle two," as if our daughter was an inconvenience, a deviation from his perfect plan of having one heir and being done. I remembered the Christmas when Derek was 16 and Nina was 13, when Richard spent $12,000 on a vintage guitar for Derek because he mentioned wanting to learn to play, something he never did, and he gave Nina a $50 gift card to Barnes& Noble with a note that said, "For the bookworm." I remembered watching Nina's face as she opened that card, watching her force a smile, watching her say thank you like she meant it, watching her pretend it did not hurt. I remembered going upstairs to our bathroom that night and crying silently into a towel so no one would hear, hating myself for not saying something, for not protecting her, for being too afraid of Richard's anger to stand up for my own daughter. That was the night something broke inside me. The night I realized I was complicit in my daughter's pain. The night I started planning an exit I would not take for another 27 years. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been the parent who stayed silent while one child was elevated and another was diminished, the one who watched inequality play out at your own dinner table and said nothing because keeping the peace felt safer than fighting the war, I need you to know something right now. Your silence was not protection. It was participation. And I know that truth burns because I have carried that burn for decades. Please hit that like button right now if you understand that guilt. If you have ever looked at your child and seen the hurt you could have prevented but did not. And in the comments, I want you to simply write, "I see you now." Let's create a wall of acknowledgement for everyone who has ever been the forgotten child, or the parent who let it happen. Because healing starts with admitting we were wrong. I drove home alone that night, taking the long route through Greenwich back roads, past estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates, past lives that looked perfect from the outside and were probably rotting from the inside just like mine had been. Our house, Richard's house, the 8-bedroom colonial that he bought because it impressed clients and neighbors, sat at the end of a circular driveway, every window dark except the one in my bedroom, the one I had left on out of habit even though I would be coming home to an empty house, even though Richard was gone, and I would never again hear his key in the lock, his heavy footsteps on the marble foyer, his voice calling out instructions about dinner or dry cleaning or whatever task he had decided I needed to complete. The silence in that house was different now. Before, the silence had been anticipatory, waiting for Richard to fill it with his presence, his opinions, his demands. Now the silence was just empty. I pulled into the garage and sat in my car for several minutes, engine off, hands still gripping the steering wheel, and I felt nothing. People talk about grief like it is this overwhelming wave that crashes over you. But what I felt was numbness, a complete absence of emotion, as if the part of me that was supposed to mourn had been worn down to nothing over 3 decades of a marriage that looked successful and felt suffocating. I walked through the house, turning on lights, moving through rooms that Richard had decorated with the help of an interior designer who charged obscene amounts of money to make everything look like a restoration hardware catalog. The living room with its uncomfortable velvet sofas that no one ever sat on. The dining room with its table that seated 16 and its china cabinet full of Herond porcelain that we use twice a year. The library with its leather-bound books that Richard bought by the yard because they looked impressive, books he never read, books that were just props in the performance of appearing intellectual. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than I wanted to think about and sat in Richard's office, the room he had declared off-limits to everyone except himself, the room where he made his important calls and reviewed his important documents, and reminded everyone that he was the one who made everything possible. His desk was exactly as he left it 3 weeks ago, before the heart attack, before the ambulance, before the hospital, before everything changed. There were papers scattered across the surface, notes in his handwriting about market trends and investment opportunities, a leather portfolio embossed with his initials, a photo of Derek in a silver Tiffany frame. Just Derek, no Nina, because that was the choice Richard made every single day, to display one child and erase the other. I opened the desk drawers one by one, not looking for anything specific, just touching his things, trying to feel something, trying to access grief that should have been there but was not. In the bottom drawer, I found a file folder labeled Estate Planning Final in Richard's neat block letters, and inside were copies of documents I had already seen, already signed, already helped create. Richard thought he was the architect of our estate plan, but the truth was more complicated than that. 5 years ago, when Richard decided it was time to formalize his legacy, he insisted on using his own attorney, a man named Philip Cartwright, who had been Richard's fraternity brother at Yale, and who approached estate planning with the same old boys club mentality that Richard approached everything. They spent weeks drafting a plan that would split everything between Derek and Nina, with me receiving a small trust that would provide for my basic needs, but would not give me real control or independence. Richard presented it to me as a done deal, papers on the kitchen counter, pen in hand, his signature already affixed, waiting for mine. He said, "This is fair, Margaret. The kids get equal shares. You get taken care of. Everyone wins." But I looked at those papers and saw what Richard could not see, or chose not to see. That giving Derek and Nina equal shares was not actually equal when one child had been given every advantage and the other had been given scraps. I had asked Richard if we could revisit the plan, suggested that perhaps we should consider a trust structure that would protect Nina from Derek's inevitable attempts to control everything, recommended bringing in a neutral third-party advisor to review the documents. Richard had looked at me like I had lost my mind. He said, "Why would Derek try to control Nina's share? They are family. You are being paranoid." But I was not being paranoid. I was being realistic. I had watched Derek operate his entire life, watched him manipulate and maneuver and take credit for other people's work, watched him learn every trick from his father about how to dominate and control. So I did something I had never done before in my marriage. I went behind Richard's back. I contacted my own attorney, a woman named Patricia Vasquez, who I had worked with on client estates during my banking career. Someone who understood family dynamics and power structures and the ways inheritance could be weaponized. Patricia and I met secretly for months, reviewing Richard's proposed plan, finding the loopholes, identifying the problems. And then Patricia helped me create an alternative structure, a trust with me as the sole trustee, with specific conditions and timelines and protections built in, a plan that would require Richard's signature, but would give me the actual control. Getting Richard to sign that revised plan was the single most manipulative thing I had ever done in my marriage, and I do not regret it for a second. I waited until he was relaxed, after a good meal, after several glasses of his favorite bourbon, after a day when everything had gone his way at work. I told him that I had reviewed the estate plan with my own attorney, which was technically true, and that she had suggested some technical revisions for tax efficiency, which was technically a lie, but not entirely untrue. I framed every change as being for his benefit, for his legacy, for his children. I never once mentioned that the revisions would give me complete control over distribution. I never once told him that I was building a cage around his favorite son's inheritance. Richard signed the papers without reading them carefully, trusting that I was not smart enough or ambitious enough to deceive him, trusting that I would never go against his wishes, trusting that I was the obedient wife he had spent 3 decades creating. That night, after Richard went to bed, I sat in this same office with the signed documents in my hands, and I felt powerful for the first time in years. I felt like myself again. I felt like Margaret Chen, the investment banker who advised billionaires on protecting their assets, not Margaret Chen, the wife who stayed quiet while her husband built inequality into their family DNA. The phone rang at 1:07 in the morning, 3 days after Richard's funeral, the screen lighting up my dark bedroom with Derek's name. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, already knowing this was not going to be good, already feeling the familiar dread that came with late-night calls from my son. Derek's voice was tight and urgent when I answered, that particular tone he used when he wanted something and wanted it now. "Mom, I need you to wire $35,000 to Amanda's account by 9 a.m. tomorrow. It is an emergency." No greeting, no explanation, just a demand. I sat up in bed, turning on the lamp, and said, "What kind of emergency requires $35,000 at 1 in the morning, Derek?" He exhaled sharply, frustrated that I was asking questions instead of just complying, and said, "Amanda's in trouble. Medical bills. I cannot get into details right now. But if we do not get this money transferred immediately, there are going to be serious consequences. I will pay you back from my inheritance next week. Just trust me, Mom. This is serious." Medical bills. At 1 a.m. With no details. With a promise to pay me back from an inheritance he did not know he had yet. The story made no sense, but then again, Derek's emergency stories never made sense if you looked at them too closely. Over the years, he had needed money for failed business ventures, bad investments, gambling debts that he called personal loans, and every time Richard had written the check, smoothed everything over, made it all go away. I asked, "What kind of medical bills, Derek? Is Amanda okay? Is she in the hospital?" There was a pause, just long enough for me to know he was calculating his answer, deciding how much truth to give me, weighing the costs of lying versus the benefits of sympathy. "She had a procedure," he finally said, "something she needed taken care of. The insurance did not cover it all, and the hospital is demanding payment. I would handle this myself, but all my liquid assets are tied up in the business right now, and I cannot access them quickly enough. You know I am good for the money, Mom. I have never not paid you back." Except he had never paid me back. Not once. Every loan Richard gave him was ultimately forgiven, written off, absorbed into the family mythology of supporting Derek's ambitions. I thought about the $16,000 speedboat Derek bought 3 years ago that he used twice before selling at a massive loss. I thought about the cryptocurrency investment scheme he begged Richard to fund, promising returns that never materialized. I thought about the consulting business he claimed to be running that consisted primarily of having expensive lunches with potential clients who never materialized. And I thought about Nina, who had asked Richard for $5,000 to help cover Emma's speech therapy appointments that insurance would not cover, and Richard had told her that perhaps if James worked harder, they would not need handouts. I cannot transfer $35,000 without knowing what it is for, Derek. If Amanda needs medical care, I will call the hospital directly and handle the bill. Give me the details. Derek's voice changed, dropping the urgent but respectful tone and shifting into something sharper, harder, more demanding. I do not need you to handle anything, Mom. I need you to transfer the money. Amanda is my wife. This is my family, and I am asking you for help. You have more money than you could possibly spend, and I am asking for a loan, not a gift. Can you just do this one thing without making it complicated? There it was. The real Derek. The one who appeared when he did not get his way immediately. The one who had learned from Richard that raising your voice and asserting dominance was an acceptable way to get what you wanted. I felt my hand tighten around the phone, felt the old familiar pattern trying to engage, the one where I backed down and complied, and made peace instead of boundaries. But Richard was gone. The man who enforced Derek's entitlement was gone. The structure that kept me compliant was gone. I said slowly and clearly, I am not transferring money without understanding what it is for. If this is a legitimate emergency, you will give me details. If it is not, you will wait until the estate reading next week, and we will discuss your inheritance and what resources you have available. Derek was silent for a moment, and I could practically hear him recalculating, trying to figure out which approach would work, which button to push. Then he said, You know what? Forget it. Forget I asked. I will figure it out myself. And he hung up, just ended the call. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, just click and silence. I sat there in my bed holding the phone, looking at the dark screen, and I felt something shift inside me, some tectonic plate of my identity moving into a new position. For 3 decades, I had been trained to feel guilty when Derek was unhappy, to feel responsible for his problems, to feel like a failure as a mother if I did not immediately fix whatever crisis he was experiencing. But sitting there in the dark, I felt nothing but clarity. This was manipulation. This was a pattern. This was a 38-year-old man who had never been told no, trying the same tactics that had always worked before, assuming they would work again. I set the phone on my nightstand and turned off the light, and I went back to sleep easier than I had slept in years. The second call came at 6:43 a.m., the phone buzzing against my nightstand, pulling me out of a dreamless sleep. I grabbed it reflexively, expecting it to be Derek with a new crisis or new angle, but the caller ID said Greenwich Police Department. My stomach dropped, that immediate flood of adrenaline that comes when you see those words, when your brain starts running through every worst-case scenario. I answered, Hello? Trying to keep my voice steady. The voice on the other end was professional, neutral, the tone of someone who delivered bad news regularly and had learned to do it without emotion. Is this Margaret Chen? Yes, this is Margaret. Mrs. Chen, this is Officer David Morrison with the Greenwich Police Department. I am calling regarding an incident involving your son Derek Chen and his wife Amanda Chen. They are both in custody at Greenwich Police Station, and we need you to come down to answer some questions. My breath caught. Custody, police station, questions. I sat up, turning on the light, trying to process what I was hearing. What happened? Are they hurt? What kind of incident? Officer Morrison paused, and I could hear paper rustling. Someone talking in the background. Ma'am, I cannot give you details over the phone. We need you to come to the station. It involves a check fraud investigation, and your name has come up in their statements. Can you come down this morning? Check fraud. My name. Their statements. The pieces started clicking together in my mind. The 1 a.m. phone call, the desperate request for money, the vague medical emergency that made no sense. I said, I will be there in 30 minutes. I got dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I pulled on clothes, my mind racing through possibilities. What had they done? What had they tried to do? Had they forged my signature? Had they tried to access accounts they did not have authorization for? I drove to the police station in a fog, barely registering the route, pulling into the parking lot of a building I had never visited before, hoping I would never have to visit. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh and institutional, the waiting area filled with plastic chairs and bulletin boards covered in community notices. I gave my name at the front desk, and Officer Morrison appeared a few minutes later, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested he had seen every possible variation of family drama play out in this building. He led me to a small interview room, asked if I wanted coffee, which I declined, and then he sat down across from me with a folder in his hands. "Mrs. Chen, your son and daughter-in-law were arrested early this morning, attempting to cash a check for $35,000 made out to Amanda Chen and allegedly signed by you. The check was flagged by the bank because the signature did not match your signature on file, and the account had a fraud alert placed on it. When bank security questioned them, your son claimed you had given them the check last night to cover a medical emergency. When they could not provide documentation of your authorization, the bank called us. We arrested them for attempted check fraud and forgery. I felt the blood drain from my face. They had forged my signature. They had created a fraudulent check. They had tried to steal $35,000 from me, and when I refused to wire the money, they had simply decided to take it themselves." Officer Morrison continued, "Your son is claiming this is a misunderstanding, that you approved the check verbally, but were too grief-stricken to remember. His wife is claiming the same thing. They are both insisting you will confirm their story." He looked at me directly, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp, watching for my reaction. "Mrs. Chen, did you authorize this check? Did you give them permission to withdraw $35,000 from your account?" I could feel the weight of the moment, the crossroads that every parent faces when their child does something unforgivable and asks you to lie to protect them. I thought about Derek as a little boy, riding his bike in our driveway, laughing at some joke Richard told him, looking up at his father with pure adoration. I thought about all the times Richard had protected Derek from consequences, smoothed over his mistakes, taught him that rules were suggestions and accountability was for other people. I thought about the pattern I had watched for 38 years, the escalating entitlement, the increasing boldness of his manipulations. And I thought about Nina, who would never dream of forging my signature, who would never manipulate or lie or steal, who had learned from watching her brother get away with everything that she needed to be perfect just to be noticed. I looked at Officer Morrison and said clearly and without hesitation, "No. I did not authorize any check. I did not give them permission to access my accounts. My son called me at 1 a.m. this morning demanding I wire him $35,000, and I refused. Apparently, he decided to take it anyway." Officer Morrison nodded slowly, making a note in his file, his expression not changing but something shifting in his posture, some confirmation that he had suspected this was the real story all along. "Mrs. Chen, we will need you to make a formal statement. We will also need documentation of your account security measures and any recent communication with your son. Are you willing to press charges?" Press charges. Against my own son. Against Derek. The words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of finality, of irreversibility, of choosing truth over family mythology. I thought about Richard, about what he would do in this situation, about how he would rage and threaten and use his money and connections to make this disappear, to protect Derek, to ensure there were no consequences. I thought about the life I had lived for 33 years, the silence I had maintained, the complicity I had engaged in. And I thought about the Margaret Chen I used to be, before Richard, before the slow erosion of my identity, the woman who built a career on making difficult decisions based on truth and analysis, not emotion and obligation. I looked at Officer Morrison and said, "Yes, I will press charges. I will make a formal statement, and I want them prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Have you ever had to make a choice that went against every instinct your family taught you, every pattern your marriage reinforced, every role you were supposed to play? Have you ever had to choose truth over loyalty, justice over peace, your own integrity over someone else's comfort? I need you to understand something right now. Choosing yourself is not selfish. Setting boundaries is not cruel. Refusing to participate in dysfunction is not abandonment. It is survival. If you are listening to this and you have ever been asked to cover for someone's bad behavior, because that is what family does, if you have ever been told that protecting someone from consequences is love, I need you to hit that like button right now. And in the comments, I want you to write 2 words: not anymore. Because change begins the moment we stop protecting people from the results of their own choices. Officer Morrison walked me through the process of filing a formal complaint, documenting the phone call, providing bank records that showed no authorized check, explaining the fraud alert I had placed on my accounts years ago after Derek had tried to use my credit card without permission, something Richard had dismissed as a misunderstanding, but I had known was intentional. The statement took over an hour, every detail recorded, every fact verified, building a case that was airtight and damning. When we finished, Officer Morrison said, "Mrs. Chen, I have to tell you, most parents in your situation would not press charges. They would accept the loss, smooth it over, keep it in the family. The fact that you are willing to hold your son accountable speaks to your character." I almost laughed at that. Character? As if I had been operating with character for the past 30 years. As if I had not spent decades enabling Richard's favoritism, staying silent during Derek's escalations, participating in the family system that made this moment inevitable. I said, "Officer Morrison, I am not holding my son accountable because I have character. I am holding him accountable because I finally ran out of excuses. There is a difference." He let me see Derek before I left, a brief encounter in a hallway outside the holding cells, Derek's face red with anger and shame, his expensive suit rumpled from a night in custody, his hair disheveled, all the polish and confidence stripped away to reveal what was underneath. A scared, entitled man who had never been told no and had no idea how to handle it. He looked at me with eyes that were identical to Richard's, that same cold calculation mixed with disbelief, and he said, "Mom, you are really going to do this? You are going to ruin my life over a misunderstanding? I was going to pay you back. This is insane." I stood there looking at my son, this stranger who carried my DNA, but none of my values, and I felt a wave of grief that was not about Richard's death, but about Derek's life, about the man he had become because Richard and I had allowed it, had encouraged it, had built a family structure that taught him he was untouchable. I said quietly, "Derek, you forged my signature and tried to steal $35,000 from me. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a crime. And for the first time in your life, you are going to face consequences for your actions instead of having someone bail you out." Derek's face shifted from anger to disbelief to something I had never seen before. Fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when you realize the safety net you have always counted on is gone, when the rules suddenly change and no one is coming to save you. He said, wait, let me talk to you. Let me explain. It was Amanda's idea. She said we could just borrow it, that you would never notice, that we would replace it before you even checked your account. I did not want to do it, but she insisted, and I was just trying to help her. Throwing his wife under the bus, lying about his involvement, playing the victim. Every predictable move from the narcissist's playbook. And I had seen Richard do every single one of these things throughout our marriage. I said, "Derek, I'm done listening to your explanations. You are 38 years old. You have a law degree from Georgetown. You know the difference between right and wrong. You made a choice, and now you get to live with it." I turned to walk away, and Derek called after me, "You cannot do this. Dad would never have let you do this. He would have protected me. He loved me." I stopped, turned back, and looked at my son with something that felt like pity mixed with exhaustion. "That is exactly the problem, Derek. Your father loved you so much, he never taught you how to be a person. He turned you into a reflection of his worst qualities. And now, you are standing here in a police station, thinking someone is going to save you. No one is coming. This is your life now. These are your consequences. Figure it out." I walked out of the Greenwich police station into morning sunlight that felt too bright, too cheerful, completely wrong for the magnitude of what had just happened. I sat in my car for several minutes, hands on the steering wheel, trying to process the fact that I had just filed criminal charges against my own son, that Derek and Amanda were facing felony charges, that their lives were about to become incredibly complicated and difficult. I waited for the guilt to arrive, for the maternal instinct to kick in, for the voice that would tell me I was a terrible mother, that I should drop the charges, that family forgives, that this was too harsh. But the guilt did not come. Instead, what I felt was a strange lightness, as if I had been carrying a weight for so long that I no longer noticed it until suddenly it was gone. I had told the truth. I had set a boundary. I had refused to participate in the dysfunction. And the sky had not fallen. The world had not ended. I was still here, still breathing, still intact. My mind drifted back to another police station, a different crisis. 23 years earlier, when Derek was 15 and Nina was 12. Derek had been caught shoplifting with some friends at a high-end electronics store in downtown Greenwich, taking a pair of Bose headphones worth $300, walking out like he owned them, setting off the security sensors, getting detained by store security. The store had called the police, and Richard and I had gone to pick him up from the Greenwich police station, the same building I had just left. I remembered sitting in the car on the drive home, Derek sulking in the back seat, Richard furious but already planning how to fix it, how to make it go away. Richard had called the store owner, someone he knew from the country club, and had offered to pay for the headphones and make a generous donation to the store's employee fund. The charges were dropped. Derek faced no consequences beyond a stern talking to from his father that lasted all of 10 minutes before Richard took him out for dinner at their favorite steakhouse. The incident already forgotten, already absorbed into the family mythology of boys being boys, kids making mistakes. Nothing serious. I remembered Nina asking me later that night why Derek got to go out to dinner after stealing something, and I had no answer for her. I had stayed silent, played my role, been the good wife who supported her husband's decisions even when those decisions were teaching her son that rules did not apply to him. But the worst part of that memory was what happened 3 months later, at Christmas, when Richard presented Derek with a gift that made the whole family gasp. A brand new Fender Stratocaster guitar, custom-made, cherry red, worth at least $3,000, wrapped in a massive box under the tree. Derek opened it, and his face lit up with joy, and he hugged Richard and said, "This is amazing, Dad. This is the best gift ever." Richard beamed with pride, loving the moment, loving the gratitude, loving the power of being the dad who could deliver magic. And then Nina opened her gift from Richard, a Barnes & Noble gift card for $50, in a simple card that said, "For the bookworm, love Dad." I watched Nina's face as she held that gift card, watched her force a smile, watched her say thank you in a voice that was trying so hard to sound grateful, watched her eyes flicker toward the guitar that cost 60 times what her gift cost, watched her understand in that moment exactly where she stood in the family hierarchy. I had excused myself to the bathroom and stood there crying, hating myself, hating Richard, hating the system we had built where one child got guitars and the other got gift cards, where one child got consequences erased and the other got ignored. That was the night I made a silent vow to myself that someday, somehow, I would make this right. That was the night I started keeping track of every inequality, every dismissal, every moment of favoritism. That was the night I became a witness instead of a participant, documenting instead of enabling, planning instead of accepting. The memory hit me with the force of revelation, and I sat there in my car outside the police station realizing that I had been preparing for this moment for 23 years. Every silent observation, every documented injustice, every mental note I had made was building toward this. The moment when I would finally have the power to rebalance the scales, to correct the patterns, to stop participating in the destruction of my own family. Richard was gone. The enforcer of the old system was gone. And I was the sole trustee of a $47 million estate with complete discretion over distribution. I was not just a grieving widow. I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner of the Chen family legacy. I drove home in a daze, my phone buzzing with calls from Derek's number that I ignored, calls from Amanda's number that I sent to voicemail, text messages that piled up unread. I needed time to think, time to process, time to plan my next moves, because this was not just about the forged check. This was about 38 years of patterns, of entitlement, of a family structure that rewarded manipulation and punished integrity. This was about Nina, who had spent her entire life being second best, being overlooked, being told implicitly and explicitly that she was less valuable than her brother. This was about Emma and her little brother Jack, my grandchildren, who deserved better than to watch their uncle get away with crimes while their mother struggled to afford speech therapy. This was about breaking a cycle that had been running for generations, because Richard had learned his favoritism from his own father and his father before him, a lineage of men who believed that love was a competition with clear winners and losers. When I got home, I found Nina's car in my driveway. Nina sitting on my front steps with 2 cups of coffee from the Starbucks drive-thru, her face worried and tired. She stood when she saw me, and before I could say anything, she wrapped her arms around me and said, "Mom, are you okay? I heard about Derek. James's cousin works at the police station, and word travels fast in Greenwich. I needed to make sure you were all right." I held my daughter, this woman who had every reason to be bitter and resentful, but who instead showed up with coffee and concern, and I felt a wave of emotion that I had been holding back all morning finally break through. I started crying, really crying, the kind of deep sobs that come from decades of suppressed grief. And Nina just held me, saying nothing, letting me fall apart on my own front steps like I had never allowed myself to do before. When I finally stopped, when I could breathe again, Nina handed me one of the coffees and said, "Let's go inside. You can tell me everything, or you can tell me nothing. I am just here." We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Richard had made pronouncements, and Derek had demanded things, and Nina had stayed quiet, trying to be invisible, trying not to take up too much space. Nina wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and said carefully, "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you pressing charges against Derek because you genuinely believe it is the right thing to do? Or are you doing it to hurt Dad somehow? To punish him for things that are not Derek's fault?" It was a fair question, the kind of question that showed Nina's fundamental decency, her inability to see the world through a lens of pure selfishness. I thought about how to answer, how to explain the complicated truth that my decision was both punishment and liberation, both revenge and justice, both personal and principled. I said, "Nina, your brother forged my signature and tried to steal $35,000 from me. Even if your father were alive, even if our family were functional, that would be a crime deserving of consequences. But to answer your real question, yes, there is a part of me that is doing this because I am angry. I am angry at your father for creating Derek's entitlement. I am angry at myself for allowing it to continue. I am angry that you grew up watching your brother get everything while you got scraps, and I am done being silent about that anger." Nina's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at her coffee, her voice barely above a whisper when she said, "I thought I was crazy. I thought I was being oversensitive, that I was imagining the difference, that I was just jealous. Derek always told me I was jealous, that I could not handle the fact that Dad and he had a special bond, that I needed to get over it. And part of me believed him." I reached across the table and took Nina's hand, squeezing it hard, trying to transfer some certainty through touch, because words felt inadequate. I said, "You were not crazy. You were not oversensitive. You were not imagining anything. Your father favored Derek systematically and deliberately, and I participated by staying silent. I cannot undo that. I cannot give you back your childhood or the relationship with your father that you deserved. But I can stop protecting Derek from consequences. I can stop enabling the pattern, and I can make sure that the family legacy I leave behind is different than the one your father created." Nina looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and she said something I did not expect. I do not want you to feel guilty, Mom. I know Dad was the one who made those choices. I know you were trying to survive. I'm not angry at you. I'm just sad that it took 38 years and a forged check for things to change. We talked for hours that morning, Nina and I, saying things that should have been said decades ago, acknowledging truths that had been festering in silence, mapping the topography of our family dysfunction with the honesty that only comes when the person enforcing silence is gone. Nina told me about the Christmas she was 13, about opening the $50 gift card while Derek got the $3,000 guitar, about going up to her room and crying herself to sleep, about deciding that night that she would never ask her father for anything because asking meant being disappointed. She told me about college application season, about getting into Northwestern with a partial scholarship, about Derek getting into Georgetown with no scholarship because Richard paid full tuition without hesitation, about Richard telling Nina that maybe she should consider a state school to save money, about the message that sent. Derek's education was worth investment. Nina's was not. She told me about her wedding, about Richard complaining that the venue was too expensive, questioning every line item in the budget, suggesting they have a smaller ceremony, while 2 years later, Derek's wedding had been a 300-person event at the Greenwich Country Club that cost over $200,000, and Richard had paid for without a single complaint. Every story Nina told added another stone to the mountain of evidence I had been building in my mind. Confirmation that what I remembered was real, that the inequality was not imagined, that my anger was justified. But Nina also told me something I had not known, something that made my heart break in a completely new way. She said, "Mom, the hardest part was not the gifts or the money or the attention. The hardest part was watching you participate in it. Every time Dad dismissed me and you said nothing. Every time Derek got something and I did not, and you smiled like it was normal. Every time I tried to talk to you about how I felt, and you changed the subject or told me I was being too sensitive. I needed you to see me, Mom. I needed you to fight for me, and you did not." She said it without anger, without accusation, just stating a fact, and that made it worse. Because she was right. I had not fought for her. I had protected my marriage, my peace, my survival, and in doing so, I had sacrificed my daughter's sense of worth. I said, "Nina, you are right. I failed you. I prioritized keeping your father happy over protecting you, and that was wrong. I do not have an excuse that makes it okay. I can only tell you that I see it now, and I am sorry. And I am going to spend whatever time I have left making sure you know your worth, even if I failed to show you before." Nina squeezed my hand and said, "I forgive you, Mom. I forgave you years ago. I just needed you to acknowledge it happened. I needed you to stop pretending everything was fine." And in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with my daughter, I felt something shift, some fundamental reordering of my priorities and loyalties and identity. For 33 years, I had been Richard's wife first, Derek's mother second, and Nina's mother third. That hierarchy was over. That system was dead. From this moment forward, I was going to be the mother Nina deserved, even if it meant burning down everything Richard had built, even if it meant making choices that the old Margaret Chen would never have made, even if it meant facing consequences I could not predict or control. Nina left around noon, hugging me goodbye, promising to call later, telling me she loved me, words that felt more real and true than they had in years. I stood in my driveway watching her drive away, and I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing since the day I signed my retirement papers from the investment bank, since the day I stopped being Margaret Chen, the professional, and became Margaret Chen, the wife, the ornament, the supporting character in Richard's story. The estate reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 6 days away, and I spent that time preparing in ways that Derek would never anticipate and could never counter. I met with Patricia Vasquez, my attorney, and we reviewed the trust documents line by line, confirming every clause, every condition, every protection I had built into the structure. The Chen family trust that I had gotten Richard to sign 5 years ago was a masterpiece of legal architecture, designed to look simple on the surface while containing layers of control and discretion that would only become apparent when activated. On paper, the trust was straightforward. The estate would be divided between Derek and Nina, with distributions managed by me as the sole trustee until certain conditions were met. But buried in the definitions and subsections and implementation clauses were provisions that gave me nearly unlimited power to determine timing, amount, and conditions of distribution. I could delay Derek's inheritance indefinitely if I determined he was not financially responsible. I could require him to complete addiction treatment, financial counseling, community service, or any other condition I deemed appropriate before receiving funds. I could reduce his distributions if he engaged in illegal activity, or if I determined that giving him money would be detrimental to his well-being. The trust essentially gave me the power to parent Derek in the ways Richard never had, to impose consequences and requirements and structure that Derek had avoided his entire life. The beauty of the document was that Richard had signed it thinking it was a standard estate plan, thinking he was taking care of his children equally, thinking he was being generous to me by giving me trustee duties that he assumed would be ceremonial. He had never read the fine print carefully enough to understand that I had built a cage around Derek's inheritance, a series of gates and locks and requirements that would force Derek to either grow up or walk away with nothing. Patricia looked at me across her desk and said, "Margaret, I have to tell you, when we drafted this 5 years ago, I thought maybe you were being overly cautious. But watching your son's behavior, seeing the forgery attempt, understanding the family dynamics, I realize you were not being cautious. You were being prophetic. You knew this was coming." I nodded, feeling the weight of those years of silent observation, those years of documenting and preparing, and waiting for the moment when I would finally have the leverage to demand change. I said, "Patricia, I spent 3 decades watching Richard create a monster. I could not stop him while he was alive, but I could prepare for what would happen after he was gone. This trust is not revenge, it is rehabilitation. Derek can have his inheritance, but only if he earns it, only if he demonstrates that he can be a responsible adult, only if he proves that Richard's money will not destroy him the way Richard's love did." Patricia and I spent hours going over the presentation I would make at the estate reading, the documents I would present, the order in which I would reveal information, the responses I would give to Derek's inevitable objections and Amanda's predictable manipulations. We role-played scenarios, practiced staying calm under attack, prepared for every possibility. Patricia said something that stuck with me. "Margaret, the most important thing you need to remember is that you do not owe Derek an explanation or a justification for your decisions as trustee. The trust gives you discretion. You are not required to defend your choices or negotiate your terms. State your decisions clearly, offer him the path forward, and let him decide whether he wants to take it or walk away. Do not let him drag you into an argument. Do not let him make you feel guilty. You hold all the power here, and power does not apologize." I repeated that phrase to myself like a mantra over the following days. Power does not apologize. Power does not apologize. Power does not apologize. It was the opposite of everything I had been taught as a wife, as a mother, as a woman in Richard's world, where power meant being accommodating and flexible and nice. But I was done being nice. Nice had gotten me 33 years of complicity in my own daughter's diminishment. Nice had enabled Derek's transformation into a criminal. Nice was over. During those 6 days between Derek's arrest and the estate reading, I also made time to reconnect with Nina in ways I had neglected for years. I took Emma and Jack to the park, actually playing with them instead of watching from a bench, pushing them on swings, helping them climb on monkey bars, being present in a way I had never been with Derek because Richard had monopolized his time and attention. I had lunch with Nina alone, just the two of us, talking about her life, her marriage to James, her dreams for her children, her frustrations with trying to make ends meet on 2 teacher salaries in one of the most expensive areas of the country. I learned things about my daughter that I should have known years ago. That Emma's speech therapy was not covered by insurance and cost $300 a week. That Jack had been diagnosed with ADHD and needed tutoring support, that Nina and James were considering moving to North Carolina, where the cost of living was lower, and James had a job offer, that Nina was exhausted from trying to be everything for everyone while feeling like she was failing at all of it. Every conversation made me angrier at Richard and angrier at myself for not seeing how much Nina was struggling, for not offering help, for not being the mother she needed. On Monday night, the evening before the estate reading, I sat alone in Richard's office, going through his things, deciding what to keep and what to discard, what had meaning and what was just performance. I found his collection of fountain pens, expensive Mont Blancs, that he displayed in a glass case like they were precious artifacts instead of tools. I found his cufflinks, gold and silver and platinum, each pair in its own velvet box, organized by occasion and outfit. I found his watch collection, 12 watches in a leather case, including the Patek Philippe that Derek now wore, its twin that Richard had been saving for some undefined future milestone. And I found a folder labeled Personal Letters that I had never seen before, buried in the back of the bottom drawer, hidden underneath tax documents and insurance policies. I opened it expecting business correspondence, maybe letters from old friends, something innocuous and forgettable. Instead, I found letters from Richard to Derek, dozens of them, written over the course of 30 years, starting when Derek was 8 years old. Letters praising Derek's accomplishments, telling him how proud Richard was, sharing advice about life and success and manhood. Letters that Richard had written and given to Derek, that Derek had read and apparently given back to Richard to keep, some shared archive of their relationship, some documentation of their bond. I read through them, feeling like I was intruding on an intimacy I had not been part of, and I realized with a cold clarity that Richard had had a relationship with Derek that I had never fully understood the depth of, a connection that went beyond favoritism into something like romance, like Richard was in love with his own reflection in his son. But what struck me most was what was missing from that folder. There were no letters to Nina, not one, not a single piece of correspondence, no birthday notes, no graduation messages, no words of encouragement or pride or love. The absence was so complete, so absolute, that it could not have been accidental. Richard had deliberately chosen to document his relationship with Derek while leaving no record of Nina's existence, as if one child deserved memorialization and the other was forgettable. I sat there holding that folder, and I felt something harden inside me, some last soft spot of nostalgia or grief for my marriage calcifying into cold resolve. Richard had not just favored Derek, he had erased Nina. He had built an entire archive of love for one child, while the other went undocumented, unacknowledged, unseen. And I had let it happen. I had participated in that erasure by staying silent, by not fighting, by choosing peace over protection. But that version of me was gone. That Margaret was dead. The woman sitting in this office holding this folder was someone new, someone who understood that love was not passive, that motherhood was not neutrality, that protecting one child meant sometimes standing against another. If you are still watching this, if you have made it this far into my story, I need you to understand something fundamental about family trauma. It is not about the big moments, the obvious abuse, the dramatic confrontations. It is about the accumulation of small erasures, the daily dismissals, the consistent patterns of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. It is about growing up in a house where one child gets letters and the other gets silence, where one child gets guitars and the other gets gift cards, where one child gets their father's attention and the other gets overlooked. That is the trauma. That is the wound. That is what breaks people slowly over decades until they do not even remember they are broken. If you see yourself in Nina's story, if you were the forgotten child, the overlooked one, the one who grew up wondering what was wrong with you, that you were not worthy of your parents' full attention, I need you to do something right now. I need you to hit that subscribe button, not for me, but as an act of claiming your own visibility, your own worth, your own right to be seen. And in the comments, I want you to write your name, just your name, because you exist, you matter, you are not invisible, even if someone made you feel that way. Write your name, and let's create a record that they failed to create. Let's document ourselves. The estate reading took place at 10 a.m. on Tuesday in the conference room of Patricia Vasquez's law office, a neutral space that felt more like a battlefield than a room. Derek arrived with Amanda and an attorney I did not recognize. A man in an expensive suit who carried a leather briefcase and exuded the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from working for clients who can afford premium rates. Derek's face was hard and angry, the boyish charm completely gone, replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled rage. He would not look at me directly, which told me he knew he had lost the moral high ground, but was too proud to acknowledge it. Amanda wore all black, as if she were in mourning, her face carefully made up to look sympathetic and wounded, playing the part of the misunderstood victim, the woman who had been caught up in unfortunate circumstances through no fault of her own. Nina arrived alone, having asked James to stay with the kids, and she sat on the opposite side of the table from Derek, the physical distance between them mirroring the emotional canyon that had always existed. Patricia sat at the head of the table with me beside her, and she began the proceedings with professional efficiency, outlining the purpose of the meeting, confirming that all relevant parties were present, reviewing the basics of estate administration. Then she presented the trust document, walking through the high-level structure. The estate valued at approximately $47 million, consisting of real estate holdings, investment accounts, Richard's business interests, and liquid assets. She explained that Richard had established the Chen Family Trust 5 years prior, naming me as the sole trustee with complete discretion over distributions to the beneficiaries, Derek and Nina. She explained that the trust was irrevocable, meaning that even though Richard was deceased, the terms could not be changed or challenged except under very specific legal circumstances that were unlikely to apply. And then she turned the presentation over to me, and I felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of years of planning, the beginning of a new chapter in our family story. I looked at Derek, and I looked at Nina, and I said calmly and clearly, I want to start by acknowledging that this process is complicated and emotional for everyone. Your father's death has left a void in our family, and grief makes everything more difficult. But my role as trustee is not to make decisions based on emotion. It is to make decisions based on your father's wishes, as expressed in the trust document, and based on my assessment of what will serve your long-term well-being. I walked through the distribution structure that Richard thought he had created. Equal shares for Derek and Nina, distributed over time based on age milestones and life events, designed to provide financial security while also imposing some structure and oversight. But then, I pulled out the second set of documents, the actual trust provisions, with all the details that Richard had not bothered to read carefully, and I began explaining the reality of what Richard had signed. I said, "What your father did not understand when he signed this trust is that it gave me significant discretion in determining the timing and conditions of your distributions. Specifically, the trust allows me to delay or reduce distributions if I determine that providing funds would be detrimental to a beneficiary's well-being, or if a beneficiary engages in illegal activity, or if a beneficiary demonstrates financial irresponsibility. These are not suggestions. These are powers explicitly written into the trust document that your father signed and that are now legally binding." Derek's face went red, his jaw clenching, and his attorney leaned forward, clearly preparing to object. But I kept talking, my voice steady, not giving him space to interrupt. "Derek, 6 days ago you forged my signature and attempted to steal $35,000 from my personal account. You are currently facing felony charges for check fraud and forgery. Under the terms of this trust, that criminal activity triggers my authority to place conditions on your inheritance." Derek exploded, slamming his hand on the table, his voice rising to a shout. "This is bullshit! Dad would never have agreed to this. You manipulated him into signing something he did not understand. You are trying to punish me because you never loved me the way Dad did. You are bitter and jealous, and you are using his death to take revenge." His attorney put a hand on his arm, trying to calm him down, but Derek shook him off. standing up, pointing at me across the table. I am not going to let you steal my inheritance. Dad built that money. He wanted me to have it. You cannot just decide I am not worthy. You were nothing but his wife. You did not build anything. You were just there. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to hurt, to diminish, to put me back in my place as the lesser parent, the supporting character, the person who did not matter. But I had been preparing for this. I had been preparing for this moment for 5 years, maybe for my entire marriage. I looked at Derek, and I let him see the full force of my anger, no longer hidden behind smiles or politeness or maternal accommodation. I said, Derek, you are right that your father wanted you to have that money, but he also signed a legal document that gives me the power to determine when and how you get it. If you do not like that, take it up with your father. Oh, wait, you cannot. He is dead. And I am the one in charge now. The room went silent, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Derek stared at me like he did not recognize me, like the mother he thought he knew had been replaced by a stranger, which was exactly right. Amanda started crying, actual tears streaming down her face, and she said in a trembling voice, Margaret, please. We made a mistake. We were desperate. Derek's business is in trouble, and we did not know what else to do. If you cut him off, we will lose everything. We have expenses, obligations, a lifestyle that we cannot maintain without the inheritance. You cannot punish us forever for one mistake. It was a masterclass in manipulation, the perfect performance of the remorseful wife, the woman standing by her man, the victim of circumstances beyond her control. But I had spent 30 years watching Richard's clients lie to me about their finances, and I could spot a con from a mile away. I said, Amanda, Derek does not have a business. He has a LinkedIn profile that says he is a consultant. What he actually has is a habit of spending money he does not earn and expecting other people to bail him out. And I am not cutting him off. I am offering him a path forward. He can have his inheritance, but only after he meets certain conditions. I pulled out another document, one that Patricia and I had prepared specifically for this moment, and I slid it across the table to Derek. These are the conditions for you to receive your first distribution from the trust. 1. Complete a certified financial planning course and provide evidence of passing the final exam. 2. Maintain full-time employment for at least 12 consecutive months in a position that does not involve family money or connections. 3. Complete 100 hours of community service at a nonprofit organization that serves low-income families. 4. Attend and complete a 12-week family systems therapy program with a licensed therapist. 5. Resolve all outstanding criminal charges related to the forgery incident, which means either having the charges dismissed, which I will not allow, or pleading guilty and accepting whatever sentence the court deems appropriate. Once you have completed all 5 conditions, I will release your first distribution of $500,000. Subsequent distributions will follow annually if you maintain the conditions and demonstrate continued financial responsibility. Derek's hands shook as he read the document, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been fear. He looked up at me and said, You are insane. These conditions are impossible. You are asking me to plead guilty to a felony. You are asking me to work a regular job like some kind of nobody. You are asking me to do therapy and community service like I am a criminal and a patient. This is not an inheritance. It is a punishment, I said calmly. Derek, these conditions are not impossible. They are standards of adult behavior. Millions of people work full-time jobs, manage their finances responsibly, contribute to their communities, and work on their mental health without considering it punishment. The fact that you see basic accountability as unbearable tells me exactly why these conditions are necessary. Derek's attorney cleared his throat and said, Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, these conditions may constitute an unreasonable restraint on the beneficiary's inheritance. We will likely challenge this in court and ask a judge to order immediate distribution under the principle that trust conditions cannot be unconscionable or against public policy. Patricia jumped in smoothly, her voice professional and unruffled. Counselor, I drafted this trust, and I can assure you that every condition Mrs. Chen has imposed is well within her discretion as trustee and well within established legal precedent. Trustees regularly impose conditions on distributions related to financial responsibility, employment, education, and rehabilitation. The fact that your client finds these conditions uncomfortable does not make them unconscionable. If you want to challenge this, feel free to file a motion, but I can tell you right now that you will lose, you will waste your client's money on legal fees, and you will delay any possibility of distribution even further. My recommendation would be that your client seriously consider meeting the conditions rather than fighting them. Derek looked at his attorney, silently asking for some magic solution, some legal loophole that would let him win. But his attorney just looked uncomfortable and said, I will need to review the full trust document and research the case law. I cannot give you an answer right now. Derek turned back to me, and his voice dropped to something quieter, but more venomous when he said, I hope you are happy, Mom. I hope this makes you feel powerful, but you need to understand something. You just lost your son. I am done. After today, I do not have a mother. You are dead to me. He stood up, grabbed Amanda's hand, and walked out of the conference room without another word, his attorney scrambling to follow. The door slammed behind them, and the silence that followed felt heavy and final, like something breaking that could never be repaired. Nina sat across from me with tears streaming down her face, and she whispered, Mom, are you okay? I looked at my daughter, and I felt surprisingly calm, surprisingly clear, surprisingly free. I said, Nina, I am more okay than I have been in 30 years. Patricia gave us a moment, stepping out of the conference room to make a phone call, and Nina and I sat there in the aftermath of Derek's explosion. Nina said quietly, He is going to hate you forever, Mom. You know that, right? He is never going to forgive this. He is never going to see it as anything other than you stealing his money and destroying his life. I nodded, having already accepted that reality, having already made peace with the loss of whatever relationship I had with Derek, which had never been real anyway, had always been transactional, had always been contingent on me playing the role of the accommodating mother who gave him what he wanted. I said, Nina, I have thought about that a lot over the past week, and I realize that what Derek calls love is really just compliance. He loves people who give him things, who make his life easier, who do not challenge him or hold him accountable. That is not real love. That is convenience, and I am done prioritizing his convenience over everyone else's well-being, especially yours. Nina's eyes widened, and she said, Mine? What does this have to do with me? I pulled out another document, one I had not shown Derek, one that was Nina's alone. Nina, the trust does not just govern Derek's inheritance. It governs yours, too. But unlike Derek, you do not have conditions on your distribution. You have immediate access to funds based on need and circumstance. I have already authorized your first distribution. I slid the document across the table to Nina, and I watched her face as she read the number. $3 million, transferring to an account in her name within 30 days. Nina's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears, and she looked at me with an expression of complete shock. Mom, I cannot. This is too much. This is not fair. Derek will— I cut her off, my voice firm. Nina, stop. This is exactly fair. Derek has received advantage after advantage his entire life. You have received nothing. Your father paid for Derek's Georgetown education in full while questioning whether you should go to a state school. Your father gave Derek $200,000 to start his consulting business that failed while telling you that James should work harder when you needed help with Emma's therapy. Your father left Derek his watch collection, and his car, and his country club membership, and 1,000 other things that had value and meaning, and he left you nothing. This is not me being unfair to Derek. This is me trying to correct 38 years of systematic inequality. Nina was sobbing now, her whole body shaking, and she said through tears, I do not know what to say. I do not know how to accept this. I feel guilty. I reached across the table and took her hands in mine. Nina, you are going to use that money to pay for Emma's therapy, to pay for Jack's tutoring, to buy a house where you want to live instead of where you can afford to live, to quit your teaching job if you want to build the life you deserve. You are going to use that money to show your children that worth is not about being the favorite or the loudest or the most demanding. It is about showing up, being kind, and contributing to the world. That is the legacy I want to leave, not the one Richard created. We stayed in that conference room for another hour, Nina and I, planning her future, talking about possibilities, crying together over what had been lost and what might be gained. Patricia came back and walked Nina through the practicalities of receiving the distribution, setting up accounts, working with a financial advisor, protecting the money from anyone who might try to manipulate her into sharing it. And I knew she meant Derek, and I knew Nina knew that too. When Nina finally left, hugging me hard and whispering, "I love you, Mom," into my ear, I felt something I had not felt in decades. Pride. Not pride in my children's accomplishments, or my husband's success, or my family's image. Pride in myself. Pride in finally doing the right thing even though it was hard, even though it cost me, even though it meant burning down the family structure I had spent 30 years maintaining. I had chosen truth over peace, justice over comfort, Nina over Derek, and the sky had not fallen. The world had not ended. I was still standing. Have you ever had to choose between two people you love, knowing that protecting one means hurting the other? Have you ever had to admit that equal treatment of unequal situations is not fairness but cruelty? Have you ever had to face the fact that fixing generational patterns means someone has to lose something they believed was theirs? This is the work of breaking cycles. This is the cost of healing. This is what it means to choose integrity over image. If my story resonates with you, if you understand the impossible position of trying to correct decades of family dysfunction in a single moment, I need you to hit that like button right now. And make sure to subscribe because this story is not over. In the comments, tell me, have you ever had to make a choice that looked cruel from the outside, but was actually the most loving thing you could do? I will be reading your stories because we need to know we are not alone in this. The weeks following the estate reading were surprisingly quiet, like the calm after a hurricane when you are waiting to see what survived and what needs to be rebuilt. Derek and Amanda did not contact me, which was expected. I received one letter from Derek's attorney outlining their intent to challenge the trust conditions, but Patricia responded efficiently, and I heard nothing more, which told me the attorney had researched the case law and realized they had no grounds to stand on. I settled into a new routine, one where I was not defined by being Richard's wife or Derek's mother, but by being myself. Margaret Chen, 59 years old, retired investment banker, woman with choices and power and agency. I started volunteering at a women's financial literacy organization, teaching workshops on retirement planning and investment basics to women who had never been given the education or opportunity to understand money. I discovered that teaching gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing since retirement, that sharing my knowledge felt meaningful in ways that managing Richard's image had never been. I reconnected with old colleagues from my banking days, women who had also navigated the corporate world while managing family expectations, and I realized how much I had isolated myself during my marriage, how much I had shrunk my world to accommodate Richard's demands. Nina and James bought a house in North Carolina, a beautiful 4-bedroom in a neighborhood with good schools and a yard big enough for the kids to play in, and they invited me to come stay for a week to help them settle in. I drove down and spent 7 days being a grandmother in ways I had never allowed myself before, playing with Emma and Jack, cooking dinners with Nina, having long conversations with James about his new job and their plans for the future. It felt like discovering a part of my family I had never known existed, a branch that had been growing quietly in the shadow of Derek's drama, but was actually healthier and stronger and more rooted in real connection.